Hey everyone, in this video I want to talk about something that I call Pails, which is an MVC framework in PHP. I actually wrote this, I started writing this back in 2014 or 2015 and have been evolving it since then. Used it in production for a few different things. I worked at a startup not long after I first started writing this and used this as the base for a lot of the web applications that I wrote there. So in this video I want to show what Pails is, how you can quickly get started using Pails in your own projects, and then kind of talk about the future of Pails and how you can get involved and contribute to the community. So on my screen here is a page from my website. It's brianparks.me/Pails. And this is a very old web page. This is something that I wrote pretty much when I started the project, partially as a reminder to myself as to what the goals of the project were. And it's still accurate. I haven't had to update it. That's the reason that it's still this old web page, is because I've stayed true to those goals, and it hasn't needed updating. So what is Pails? Pails is minimalist. From the very beginning, I wanted to make this as small a project as possible, specifically so that it didn't get bloated, it didn't become opinionated, it didn't start to take over the world and tell you how you had to write your code. And that actually plays into some of the other things. It's object-oriented, which for me was very important. It's MVC, and intentionally, that's the only rule that it has. It doesn't even have that rule. There are conventions that you can build controllers, but there's no requirement that you build views a certain way. There's no requirement that you build models a certain way. There's no requirement that you even have a database, or that you use a specific database or use it in a specific way. In fact, I've used Pails on multiple different database backends with different libraries to communicate to them. It's infinitely extensible. From the very beginning, I wanted to make it plugin ready, and this was back in the days before Composer was really popular. So it actually had its own plugin system, but now Composer is the way to go. I intend it to be fast. I haven't done any benchmarks on it, but I don't do any crazy processing in the library, and that's intentional. I'll probably do some benchmarks at some point, but we'll get there, when we get there. It's written in PHP, scalable, unrestricted, intended to be used however you want, rapid application development friendly. This actually allowed me to go from 0 to demoable code in days rather than months. This was back when I wrote it, so back in the kind of the early days of PHP MVC frameworks. Obviously, all of them provide some functionality for this goal, but prior to that, I was building a lot of PHP apps with a lot of boilerplate, and it just took a long time. And this is production ready. I have run applications in production using Pails. It's not widely used, but it is production ready, and that's an important point that I want to stick to. I don't want this to be, just a beta piece of software that, for some period of time, regardless of version number. This is production ready, and it's intended to be able to be used in production. And if you feel that it's not there, definitely file a bug report. Which brings us to the next part of this video, which is where you can get Pails. Pails is on my GitHub, github.com/bparks/Pails. And this is all it is. It's really not that big. This README provides the quick start and the information and other technical details and other features. It's very Rails inspired. It's very C# MVC inspired. There are actually some features that I'm adding that I intend to be, they're kind of Express inspired. But the real goal is to make this usable, easy to adopt, accessible, just really easy to get started and get started quickly and have this as a solid foundation underneath your web application. So let's get started. I'll switch over to, well, I have this Windows subsystem for Linux instance over here, and I'm actually in a directory called Pails demo, and you'll notice that there is nothing there, and that's intentional. I do have it opened up in Visual Studio Code. So really quickly, let's create a completely dummy PHP app, kind of in the old school way. So we'll do PHP, then PHP info, nothing fancy. Just let's pretend this is a legacy PHP app, and this is actually what I was working on when I started building Pails. I had a legacy PHP app that had a bunch of scripts that kind of all did their own things with includes and requires, and it was, you know, what we think of as, you know, spaghetti PHP now. But I wanted to be able to convert it into an MVC style app without having to rewrite huge swaths of the application all at once in order to still have it work. So I had an app, something like this, and of course to run this you could go over to Linux and do PHP -s localhost, let's say 8000. I don't think I have anything running on that port, and we'll say dot, right? And now we have this running on port 8000. Current directory is the working directory, so we can go over to web browser, localhost 8000, and I did something wrong. What did I do wrong? Because I don't want to put that there. Document root is current directory. I don't have a router file. That's what it was looking for. So let's go back over here, refresh, and boom, we have the output of PHP info. Okay, great. We have our sample legacy PHP app. So let's go back to Visual Studio Code and let's convert this into a Pails app. So first up, let's create a couple directories. We'll say public, and we don't want it in public. We want another one called app. And the only thing we're going to do is move our info.php into public. And basically what you would do if you had a legacy PHP app is you take your legacy PHP app and copy everything into public. Because what we're actually going to do is, instead of running php-s here, we're going to push d into public and then run that command. And whether that succeeds or fails, we'll just pop back. Right? Okay, so now working directory is Pails demo public. If we go back to our info page over here, let's refresh. And that refreshed so fast, it does work. In fact, let's prove that by going to slash, right? Slash doesn't exist. Info.php, boom. Okay, same thing, just moved to a slightly different place. So without making any changes to our application, it still works. Of course, we also haven't included Pails, so let's do that. Composer, require Pails. And yes, I'm using a super old version of Composer. I actually don't do too much PHP anymore. I'm mostly a C# developer. But in just a couple of minutes, we'll have Pails installed, and it doesn't have any dependencies. That's awesome. It's just self-contained, and now we have Pails over there. So now let's change this command slightly. We do have a router file when it comes to Pails to handle the MVC stuff. So we actually need to go to vendor, Pails, and it's called router.php. Now we got autocomplete because we're in the current directory, but when we cd into the public directory, we will actually need a .. in order to get back to the right place. So let's do that. Everything's running. Now let's switch back to our browser and see if info.php still works. And of course it does. And that's because Pails looks for files on disk first. So if you have files on disk and you're using them as your routes, totally fine. Pails will not get in the way of that. Okay, so now what if we wanted to create something so that going to slash would actually work? Well, right off the bat, and because we're in development mode, we actually get error messages for this. We see the default controller does not exist. Okay, cool. Let's create default controller. So we create our controllers inside the app folder, inside a folder called, you may have already guessed this, we'll call them controllers. And then let's create a new file. Let's call it default controller. Right, and now this is going to be a PHP file. So let's create a class, default controller, and it has to extend Pails controller. You can do whatever syntax you want here, right? And Pails by default, any public method is an action. So let's do public function, let's say index, and let's return, we'll say this content hello world. Right? Nothing fancy there. What did I forget here? Did I forget how to use PHP? That's possible. Use. I actually need to go over to my cheat sheet. It's been a while. Let's go over here. Nope, I had it right the first time. Okay, there we go. I'm not sure what this is complaining about. It's probably just the Visual Studio Code linter, but that should be good. So now, if we go to web browser, there we go, hello world. Okay, so now what if we wanted to actually use a view? So we're just using controllers. What if we wanted to use a view? We can do that too. We can go back to app, new folder, views, and views are nested in a folder structure that mirrors the controllers. So we'll new file, we'll call this default, and then new file called index.php. Right, and all we'll do is an h1 hello world. Right, nothing fancy. Now let's go back to the controller and let's actually use that view. So Pails does a lot of convention over configuration. So if you use a view with the same folder and file name as the controller and the action, you don't have to specify the name of the view. So that's what we're doing here. And now we can go back over here and boom, hello world with an h1. But what if we want to have a layout? Well, we can do that too. Again, let me take a peek at my cheat sheet real quick to make sure I'm doing this the right way. Yeah, so by default, Pails uses a file in views called _layout.php. This is all customizable, and most of it is documented. If you can't find this in the documentation, submit a bug report so I can add it to the documentation. And we'll do just a standard, we'll kind of take some liberties with this. That's not what comes next. That's what comes next. Title welcome to Pails. And okay, we have our basic HTML. Let's add an H1 here that says this is the layout. Right? And now, how do we get the actual view that's going to render to render inside the layout? The way we do that is PHP this render. It's not an echo. It's just a function call that has side effects. So we'll do that. And now we have our view that says hello world. We have our view that says this is the layout. And if we go back to the browser and refresh, we'll get both. And that's, again, that convention over configuration. All of this is configurable, but by convention, Pails looks at specific directories. And if you don't have something there, it doesn't blow up. It doesn't break. There's very little boilerplate when it comes to Pails. My philosophy is that, well, I can't stand boilerplate. I think boilerplate is terrible. I don't really want to have a bunch of code before I can start writing my actual code. I want to just include the package I want to use and start using it right away. So Pails has very little boilerplate. You know, most of what we've seen is just, you know, my specific choices. I wanted to have a layout. I wanted to have a view, but there's nothing requiring you to do any of this in order to accomplish what you're trying to do. You can literally install Pails, do nothing else, and, you know, granted, you're not really using much of Pails at that point, but do nothing else, and everything will still work. That was a foundational principle when I started building Pails. Okay, so what else can I show? Let's talk about configuration. So by default, there's a kind of a concept of routes, and by default, Pails will kind of figure out what you mean. So if you went to, say, my stuff, no, let's just say stuff, stuff / me, right? It's going to complain that stuff controller does not exist. That's because, again, convention over configuration. It's trying to figure out what to do based on the small amount of information that you've actually given it. And by default, that's because Pails kind of implicitly has a route configured, and we'll go over to, we'll kind of create this and show that this is exactly how it works. Right here. So in the app directory, we'll create a directory called config, and inside of that directory, we'll create a file called application.php, assuming I can spell. And inside of that file, all we're going to do is create an array. I guess we need to be in PHP mode in order for this to work. There we go. Create an array, and we'll say everything maps to false, false. Basically, what that is given a particular path, it maps to a particular controller and a particular action. If you don't want to specify the action, if you want that to be figured out from the URL, put false there. If you want the controller to be figured out from the URL, put false there. Typically, you would, if you were going to have one of the two be false, you would specify a controller and leave the action as false. I think it would work the other way around. I haven't actually tested that, but I don't really know if there's a purpose for that. Let's fix our syntax there. So anything maps to false, false. And let's go back over here, and it'll still tell us the stuff controller does not exist. Now if we go back to here, we'll get exactly what we had before. Even if we do default / index, we'll get what we had before. If we leave off that second part of the URL, we still get the index page. And that's, again, because of how all that convention works. So Now let's specify a new route. So let's say instead of stuff going to stuff controller, stuff should go to things. And we'll still say false there, right? So now if we go to localhost :8000/stuff, we'll get an error. The controller things controller does not exist. And how do we do that? So let's add a new controller, right? Things controller. And as a teaser, I'll actually say that if you want some additional functionality, there is something called a resource controller. And you would get that by doing this. And you get a little bit of functionality for free. Now you do have to specify specific methods, and that's a more advanced topic that I won't get into in this video. But that's actually pretty cool, and you can check out the documentation, or you can go straight to the resource controller class, and you can see what it's all about. So obviously it extends a controller, and then it does specific things with the URL, which are pretty cool. Yeah, so for here we'll just extend a controller, and let's public function me return this. Let's do JSON, and we'll say something like, name Brian, job software engineer. Right, that sort of thing. And now let's go over to our web browser. And obviously things controller does not have an index, but if we go stuff me, now we have some JSON that gets spit out. And whatever we pass into that JSON call gets turned into JSON, and that's something that we can return in the response. What other things are cool? So obviously databases. You might want to do databases. So by default, Pails has support for, well, it was PHP Active Record, but that project, I'm not sure if it's dead or just kind of inactive. So I actually forked it. There's a Pails version of it that you can see, Pails Active Record. Again, forked from PHP Active Record. And I added a couple things to it. Nothing earth-shattering. I just wanted to be able to use some additional functionality that I liked from C# Entity Framework, specifically link queries, that didn't exist in PHP Active Record. It doesn't necessarily make it faster. It just made it faster for me to do some development. And then there are some things I want to improve on that front. But it works well enough. Again, I'm using this in production, so it works well enough for me. But the way that it works is you do need to do some kind of upfront configuration. So there is a way to specify connection strings. Let's just say development, because this is the mode we're running in right now. And you could do something like MySQL, that sort of thing, right? And then in order to use that, there is actually some additional, unfortunately, there is some additional boilerplate. And that goes in a folder in app called Initializers. And this initializers is basically a way that you have to customize how things start up and how things get initialized. So if you have a package that needs to have like an access token or something like that, you would put it in an initializer. And Pails doesn't do any dependency resolution on the initializers. So what you need to do is have the initializers alphabetically in the order that you want them to execute. So you can use numbers at the beginning, you could use letters at the beginning. The important part is that underscore startup.php should go first. Basically what Pails does is if a startup.php and underscore startup.php is present, it includes that one first and then does everything else alphabetically. So I'm just going to copy this from my cheat sheet. And I guess I want to open up PHP mode, don't I? And this is basically the boilerplate from PHP Active Record, wrapped in an if statement just to check, are there some connection strings that exist? And this is checking the application object to determine if connection strings were set in application.php. So if we go back to startup.php, you can see there's a log, and then it initializes Active Record with the model directory and the connection strings. And here's a way you can check what environment you're running in. By default, it's development, and there is a way, obviously, to set things like staging, production, that sort of thing. Okay, so this models directory, where does that go? Well, just like everything else, in the app folder. And so we'll create models, and then of course here you can create just plain old PHP objects. There is a specific hierarchy for certain types of objects in the Active Record model. So you inherit from a specific type of model, and then magically it has all this functionality. I won't show that on camera here, but that's basically how you would do it. And I do have some examples of that, and there is some documentation as well. And it basically follows the PHP Active Record documentation. Everything that works in PHP Active Record works in Pails Active Record. Again, it's a fork of that project. But if you have a specific ORM that you would rather use, or if you don't want to use an ORM, that's fine too. Pails is 100% unopinionated when it comes to things like that. You don't even have to use an ORM if you don't want to. If you want to go directly against, say, MongoDB, knock yourself out. Go directly against MongoDB. Okay, the other thing that I want to mention before we close out is that there are some plugins that make Pails even more enjoyable to use. And some of them are mentioned here as dependencies, or they have a dependency on Pails. So Pails Action Mailer is a Rails Action Mailer-like implementation for Pails. So it can use actions to build emails. So that's pretty cool. Installer it's exactly like it says. It's an installer. So you can load that up and you can get a little GUI, kind of like the WordPress installer or Drupal or that sort of thing. Auth provides some authentication for Pails, kind of an identity provider sort of thing. And that's evolved over the years. It was very simple initially, and it gradually got more complicated. So there is some support for OAuth to like things in it. Blog provides a blog functionality for Pails. It's actually what I'm running on my website. Pails content, blog depends on Pails content. Pails content forms the base for a CMS style functionality in Pails. Menu provides a way to kind of build a menu from some of these other plugins if you wanted to. And then file provides support for file upload and management through Pails. So some cool things there. If you like Pails, go ahead and hit the star. Feel free to fork it. Watch the repository. Again, I'm not much of a PHP developer anymore. I've switched over to C# a lot. But PHP is still cool, and PHP is a language that is near and dear to my heart. So I do want to keep this project going, and I want to share it with you guys, the community, and I want to give you the option to continue Pails and use Pails, and I want it available as a resource to you guys. So if you want to contribute to the project, absolutely go for it. I'd love to have contributions. You can see there are a couple issues over here, and I'll probably be adding more as I think of some. And again, if you come across something, absolutely create an issue here. I'm working on this one. I think adding a modern routing option, kind of like what Express has, is something that people might want. So that's something that I'll be working on in the near future. And of course, if you find bugs, let me know, put them here, and we'll all work together and make Pails even more awesome. I think Pails is pretty awesome. I've used it a lot. It's really easy to get started, in my opinion, though I might be slightly biased. But I hope you find it just as easy, and if you don't find it just as easy, submit an issue. Let's make it just as easy. Okay, that's all I got. I'm going to stop talking. Hope you enjoyed this. Give this video a like, and check out Pails. I'm really excited to see where this goes.